Welcome to another week of our Public Interest Technology Colloquium. Today we've got Dr. Anne Cavoukian with us. Presenting, we can't put this off any longer. The time to preserve our privacy and security by design is now. This colloquium is brought to you by ASU's School for the Future of Innovation in Society, also the Society Policy Engineering Collective, SPEC, the group that I direct, and the presentation will be recorded and broadcast at the IEEE International Symposium on Technology and Society this November 12th to the 15th. My name is Katina Michael, and I'm the program chair of the new Masters of Science in Public Interest Technology. And I also have a joint appointment in the School of Computing, Informatics and Decision Systems Engineering. It's my absolute joy to welcome Dr. Anne Cavoukian, the Executive Director of the Global Privacy and Security by Design Center. My husband, MG Michael, first met Anne Cavoukian at the 29th Privacy Commissioners Conference in Montreal, Canada in 2007. And as Anne is well known for juggling many things, she was holding 2 mobile phones and talking to 2 different people at the time. And Michael returned from Canada and said, she's a pocket dynamo. In fact, in one of the IAPP celebrations where they were celebrating Anne's 30 years in governance and government, particularly privacy and security, somebody said probably the Energizer company would have had an issue with choosing either Anne or the bunny as the brand, because Anne is amazingly energetic and has thrown herself in so many different things. We're going to hear about a lot of things today. I think we're going to be spoiled. It's one of those interviews that you hope to do once in your lifetime. This is the second time I'm interviewing Anne, and we're listening to her about her life's work. I would like to say a special wish to Anne. Indeed, today is her birthday, and as has come to be known of Anne, she will willingly present and have outreach at any day of the year, at any time, so long as she knows about the event. But I wanted to give the opportunity not only to say happy birthday, Anne, but may all your wishes come true. I think I'll let you say a few words.
Thank you so much, Katina, for your very kind words. I am eternally grateful, and especially to your husband as well. We met and we've stayed friends for such a long time. And thank you. I have one birthday wish that I'm going to ask for everyone listening to this, and that is defy the odds. Do not accept, well, privacy's dead, get over it. No, you get over it. I tweet every morning. I have quite a large Twitter following, and invariably 1 or 2 people will tweet me back and say, lady, get over it. That ship has sailed. And I say, are you kidding me? Get another freaking ship. You don't just say, that's it, we're going to give up because it's hard to do. Oh my God, it's the last thing you do. I'm going to tell you a small personal story before I get into my talk. It's directly related to this. And the reason I started telling this story, last year I was out west giving a keynote that I'd been invited to, and I was there early, and the organizer said to me, tell us a story about your life. Just tell us something we don't know. And I told them the following story. And they said to me, you must start your speech, your talk, with that story. I said, I've never done that. I've never talked publicly about that. And they said, you absolutely must. I said, okay. I did. I led with this story, and I had a standing ovation. I mean, it was unbelievable just for this story. And the story, my thanks go to my grandfather. So imagine, so I'm Armenian, that's my background. 1915, Armenian genocide. My grandfather, my grandparents, and the 3 kids, my father would have been 3 years old at the time, they were scheduled to be killed the next morning. So my grandfather is thinking, what can I do to save my family? And what does he know how to do? He was an artist, a painter, a magnificent painter, but so what, right? So what? Here's what he did. This is my grandmother telling me the story. She said, your grandfather always carried parchment paper and charcoal with him wherever we went because he loved to paint and draw. And that morning, earlier in the day, he had seen General Pasha, the head of the Turkish group, and he had seen him. So that night, from memory, my grandfather etches a portrait of General Pasha, thinking who the hell knows what, but that's what he did. And in the morning, he rolls it up and he gives it to the soldier who was ushering them out to be killed. And he said, please give this to General Pasha with my regards. And the soldier says, stupid man, what's he going to want to do with this? Forget it. And my grandparents thought everyone was going to be killed. Minutes before they're about to be killed, General Pasha comes riding in on horseback, waving the parchment paper, waving it. And he says, who did this? I want to know who did this. And my grandfather says, Efendi, that's sir in Turkish. I did it. The general says to him, I like it very much. You and your family, you're free to go. That's what saved my father, who was 3. I mean, I wouldn't be here otherwise if it wasn't the brilliance of my grandfather to defy the odds and to think that no matter how unlikely it was that he could save his family through his art, he thought, the hell with it, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to try. And that's the messaging I'm giving to you. Defy the odds. Surveillance is mounting, of that there's no question. Our privacy is at risk on a growing daily basis. Doesn't matter. We have to preserve our privacy now and well into the future. It forms the foundation of our freedom. We can do this. We must do this. So if it helps at all to remember my grandfather's story, please think of that and defy the odds. So Katina, I'm sorry I started off like that, but I wanted to tell that story.
Well, and those who know me know that I care about people a lot. And it wouldn't surprise you at all that the 6 hours that I've spent preparing for this presentation, I came across this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful tweet. And I'm going to run to it right at the end of this presentation. I was keeping it to the end. And we haven't spoken about this, but you know how much I adore you and I get you. And that is the whole message here. This colloquium is about understanding people, understanding where they've come from, understanding why that's important. And you've tweeted what, 50,000 tweets? I don't know how many, Anne, but many. And this morning I came across this one from 2018. You were replying to a gentleman who was accusing you of something and you said, I wasn't born in the West. My grandparents barely escaped the Armenian genocide. They valued privacy a lot more once they realized what harm could arise from the wrong people knowing their nationality. And the very previous slide, which is very unconnected to Twitter, was this. Would you like to tell us about this?
Can I tell you the story? So
yes.
I also paint, but I didn't know I painted. I started maybe around 2010, and I was just trying to look for something that was not a right brain activity. And my grandfather was a brilliant artist. My father was an amazing portrait photographer. And so I thought, I must have some of this in me. So I just started etching and painting, and that's one of the first ones that I did. Thank you for finding that.
Well, what's amazing is your grandfather saved his whole family, and in fact is probably responsible for your birth in Egypt
Yes.
years later. And
Yes.
I think something, you know, a lot of people ask what motivates someone to actually dedicate their entire life to a field, whether it's human rights, privacy, security, First Nations people, whether it's women who are suffering and surviving domestic violence, whether it's the field of autism or dementia, whether it's cancer specialization, whatever it is, there has to be something that awakes in you in the morning, a calling that says, I'm going to be motivated to dedicate my life to this. And I think for those who don't know your story, and if I was to switch screens here, again, there was no fudging on my part. These screens were open before this talk began. But you can see that I've gone to the Wikipedia page of the Armenian genocide to understand, because I heard a comment at an SAI conference, and I went through maybe 15 videos overnight, listening to you repeat this important story about why. And one thing I know about you, Anne, because aside of politics, and you've been in government, right, as an information and privacy commissioner, putting aside religion, putting aside ethnicity, putting aside, one thing that you've repeatedly done is supported humans. And when we go through these photographs, these digests of people you've touched in your life, through your government work, through your outreach, I mean, Anne, you've talked on podcasts of civic individuals that nobody knows. You'll give that person equal time to the person in government who are saying, Anne, investigate this location-based services regulation or this health privacy issue. And so I wanted to know why, what drove you? What was it about you as an individual? And I'm encouraging the people who are listening to this, because they have to have no fear. You give us this air about you. There is no fear. There is a motivation towards why you are doing things. And at the end, it's about being human. And one thing, I think the biggest compliment someone's ever paid you, and you've made on a Bloomberg interview, was that you're not interested in coming to loggerheads with people. That's not, we can go and put down laws and change things through regulation, and that takes a long time. But you always talk about the informal route, dialogue. Can you tell us about the importance of that through your whole career?
Definitely. Thank you so much. Very kind of you, Katina, for those lovely words. And I always like to remind people, we're going to start my talk in 2 minutes, but I like to remind people of the consequences of not having privacy. And it's not just about your privacy. It can impact your life. So my grandmother, the final thing about the story I started with, she told me that when they were in the prison, awaiting to be killed the next day in the Armenian genocide, that she said, people in the prison, if they uttered a word in favor of Armenians, and if that was heard, the Turkish guards would just kill them right on the spot. So my grandma said, she's always looking over your shoulder, whispering, being careful not to be overheard. This had life and death consequences back then. And now, I'm not suggesting that it's the same, but I'm suggesting that freedom is so important. It's just absolutely critical. I was born in Cairo, as you know, and we came over to Canada when I was 4 years old. But my mom told me that my father was a portrait photographer, had a brilliant, wonderful studio. And when they were raising their children there, they had wonderful freedom. It was before Abdel Nasser came into power. It was under British rule. And Mom said under British rule, everybody was free to get along with whoever, you know, the Armenians, the Christians got along with the Jews, they got along with the Arabs, everybody got along. There was no issue. And then the British pulled out. Abdel Nasser came into force late 50s. And she said everything changed overnight. The banks were nationalized. You couldn't take your money out. My dad was appointed as the official photographer to Abdel Nasser. So we have no freedom whatsoever. And for my parents, not having freedom was unthinkable. Just think about what grandparents went through. So my father and my mom told me that they had to leave Cairo. They had to leave Egypt. And one of the colleagues of my dad, who was also a photographer from Belgium, was visiting him. And my dad said, if I can ship my camera, and back there cameras were like huge, standalone things. If I can ship my camera to you, would that be acceptable? And then we're going to try to escape to Canada. If we escape to Canada and I'm successful, would you ship the camera to me in Canada? And his colleague said, of course. So got rid of the camera. And then in the dead of the night, my mom said they had 8 suitcases, 2 mothers, my 2 grandmothers, and 3 children. And they got on the ship and we went to Canada. And when we arrived here, we stayed in the basement of a friend's home, thank God, a dear friend. And we stayed there for 6 months until my dad got his business up and running. Can you imagine going from a charmed life where you didn't want for anything, going from that to living in someone's basement with virtually no money, no anything, and 3 children and 2 grandmothers? I mean, what my parents gave up to raise their children in freedom, unbelievable. So I owe so much to my parents, my grandparents, and I just want to make sure that our children and grandchildren can live in freedom. And for that, we need privacy. So, Katina, enough stories. Shall I start my talk?
Yes, and I'll get that ready. One thing I wanted to add in closing to this beginning is that we have a lot of students at Arizona State University in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society that are studying human and social dimensions in their PhD work, science and technology policy, and our public interest technology. And we've been very fortunate to have attracted some very diverse students who, in some cases, are refugees, do want to study privacy, do understand the consequences of genocide, and do understand the importance of humanity coming together to offer solutions. So with that, I will share your slides now and just appreciate you taking this opening time to tell us about your background.
Wonderful. Thank you.
If I can.
Thank you for letting me lead with that.
Oh, look, this is what this colloquium is all about. We're trying to be more authentic, and we're trying to actually bring out those stories that matter. Stories actually run the world. Oral tradition. We're forgetting about oral tradition, not just the written histories. But with this, I've turned to Wikipedia very quickly. As we can see, you were the Information and Privacy Commissioner for the Canadian province of Ontario. You spent 3 terms, the longest anyone has, from 1997 to 2014. And then you became the Executive Director of Ryerson's Privacy and Big Data Institute in 2014, provided these certifications that people can still do through the university at Ryerson. And then in 2017, you took up a Distinguished Expert in Residence at the university's Privacy by Design Center for Excellence. And now you're running your own company, which you're calling a center, right? It's Global Privacy and Security by Design Center. But I also wanted to give people right up front the website that they can go to and see your myriad of videos. And then this fundamental time, people have commented that one of the great things about your work is that you were able to brand what you did so that it was accessible by people. In this case, the Privacy by Design has been translated in 150 different languages. And these are the 7 foundational principles that we now find embedded in the European GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. So with that, Anne, over to you. And I appreciate it that you've given me this time to introduce you properly.
Oh, thank you so much. And I want to tell your audience, if you're in Arizona, we have a place in Arizona. We come down in the fall, November, and then I go back and forth. Now, with COVID, who the heck knows when we'll be able to return there, but I'm looking forward to it. And then if you want to contact me, I would love to offer whatever help I can in any way. Okay, let's start by the next slide. Let's dispel the myths. I always want to start with that slide because in the next slide, please, you'll see that people often think privacy is about secrecy. It has nothing to do with secrecy. It's not about having something to hide. This could have been the motto of the Stasi police and the Third Reich, because they're saying, well, if you have nothing to hide, what's the big deal? The big deal is that privacy is essential to freedom and putting you in control. In the next slide, I talk about privacy equals control. In the next slide, it's all about personal control. You as the user, it's critical that you be in control of your information. That freedom of choice is essential because you see, only you know the context associated with your data. Nobody else knows that. Is it sensitive? Is it not? The Germans have a wonderful term for this called informational self-determination. And it's all about the individual being able to determine the fate of his or her personal information. And the reason I like to use context, and I use myself as an example whenever I can, personal health information is the most sensitive personal information in existence, and it should be so strongly protected. No one should have access to it unless you choose to enable them to have access. I like to talk about myself because I want to give people actually hope. I've had a lot of neurosurgery 5 neurosurgeries, brain surgery. Touch wood, I haven't had any for 10 years and I'm good. There was a small tumor in my head. It just happened to be blocking the drainage of cerebrospinal fluid. So they didn't go after the tumor because it was too sensitive, the location it's in. All the nerves pass through that. They didn't want to touch it. So they put in a pump in my head and a shunt, a tube that runs down. And most of the time it works well. But just like if you have a cut on your hand, scar tissue tries to form over it to heal it. Well, if you have a pump in your head and it's open and it's got to pump out cerebrospinal fluid, otherwise, it'll grow in your head and you'll have a stroke and you'll die. So it's essential. Scar tissue sometimes wants to form over the pump because it thinks you're injured and it wants to heal you. So that's happened to me 5 times where they have to go in, remove the scar tissue, put in a new pump. Oh God, it's a nightmare. Anyway, touch wood, my last surgery was perfect and I'm perfect now. The reason I like to give this story is I want to give people hope. Not just people are going through neurosurgery, but major surgery, major health crises. And you think, oh my God, how am I ever going to get over this? It's extremely difficult at the beginning. I want to give people hope. That's why I choose to talk about my medical background. But would I suggest anyone else do that? No, it's entirely up to you. In fact, it can have enormous consequences. The first time when I had applied for the position of privacy commissioner here, I almost got the job, and then they called the EA, the executive assistant of the former commissioner, and asked her, how did she think I was? Did she think I was up for the job? Could I handle it, given all my surgeries? I mean, my God, they're asking her, what if she didn't like me? Fortunately, she liked me, and she told them, yeah, of course, she can do it with her eyes closed. But if she hadn't liked me, or if there was an issue there, it's absurd that they would have gone to her. If they'd asked me for my consent to go to my neurosurgeon, my neurologist, all my doctors, I would have given it to them, but they didn't. They chose to go under the hood, under the cover, and speak to someone who, fortunately, held me in good stride. But if she didn't, I would never have gotten the job. So I just like to give you that example as how your personal health information can be used potentially against you in ways that you can't even contemplate. Okay, let's move on. I always talk about how privacy is essential to freedom. It forms the foundation of our creativity, innovation, resulting prosperity. A society requires this kind of freedom. And I always like to give the story of Steve Jobs, the creator of Apple, the brilliant, brilliant man. He used to buy a new white Mercedes in California every 6 months, less a day. 6 months less a day, he would take his white Mercedes into the dealership and then get a new one and take it back. And he kept doing this every 6 months less a day. And you might say, why the heck would he do that? Because at that time in California, you had up to 6 months before you had to get a license plate number put on your car. And he didn't want a license plate number. He didn't want to be tracked or recorded or anything. He didn't want that associated with him. So he kept changing it. Unfortunately, after he died, they changed the law in California. So you have to get a license plate number very quickly now. It's just an example. You know, people who want to engage in crazy, wild ideas, blue sky thinking, you need to have privacy. You need not to look over your shoulder and worry about who's looking, who's tracking, who's doing what. And surveillance is the antithesis of privacy. It's the exact opposite. It's a negative consequence of surveillance is it shrinks your cognitive bandwidth. Sorry, I talk like that. I'm a psychologist. That's my background. And the whole thing is you want your cognitive bandwidth to be as wide as possible to have the kind of blue sky thinking that is essential to creativity and prosperity. Let me turn to privacy by design. And I call it the decade of privacy by design because in 2010, it was unanimously passed as an international standard. In the next slide, that'll indicate it. And here's what surprised me. So privacy commissioners have a privacy conference once a year, usually in Europe. In 2010, it was in Jerusalem. And at the end of a 3 or 4 day conference, we have a half day devoted to commissioners introducing any resolutions that they want to be voted on by the entire assembly of privacy commissioners and data protection authorities. And that year, I introduced a resolution that privacy by design, which I should tell you, I created literally at my kitchen table over 3 nights, many, many years ago. My first term as privacy commissioner. And it actually took a while to get my lawyers on side because it was a different way of thinking about privacy, that I wanted to embed the much needed privacy protective measures directly into everything you're doing, bake it into the code, embed it into your operations, into your policies. The whole goal was a model of prevention, much like a medical model of prevention. You want to prevent the privacy harms from arising. And this is very different from a traditional regulatory compliance view. So that's why I was so surprised that all the brilliant commissioners at this conference unanimously passed this as an international standard. And when I talked to them afterwards, because most of them are like what I call lawyers, brilliant lawyers who love to drill down into Section 29, Sub 2, Part A, and apply that to the fact situation to get a wonderful resolution. When I talked to them afterwards to thank them for voting in favor of this, I was curious as to why. And it became very, very clear to me in the next slide. It was just apparent to everyone that the way we were doing it in terms of regulatory compliance was too little too late. That it was just, we were just reaching the tip of the iceberg. That the majority of the privacy harms that were arising these days of massive social media and interconnectedness and everyone being online, that the base of the iceberg was no longer being addressed. And that's where the majority of the privacy breaches remained, unchallenged, unknown, unregulated. So they said regulatory compliance alone is no longer sustainable as the sole model for ensuring the future of privacy. We need to add privacy by design, again, to complement it. And it's been translated into over 40 languages. And in the next slide, and I should add, if any of you have a language that's not in there, please let me know and let's talk. 2 essentials to privacy by design. I've already talked about model of prevention. You have to be proactive and address issues before the harm has arisen. And also banish zero-sum models. Oh my God. Zero-sum drives me crazy, as I put in the next slide. Zero-sum means you can only have a positive gain in one area, security, always to the detriment of the other area, privacy, says that the two total to a sum of 0. It was never privacy that gained over the other interests, nor am I suggesting it should be, but I sure as heck wasn't going to have it lose out every time. Zero-sum is fundamentally flawed. It's an either-or model, win-lose, predicated on only one party ever winning. And so in the next slide, I'll tell you about how I address this. I went around the world talking to technologists, data scientists, and I said, I want to deliver both. Can you tell me we can deliver both? It's called positive sum, where you have 2 positive gains at the same time. Privacy and security, privacy and business interests, privacy and marketing. You can do both. I said, I want to make sure we can do both. I want a win-win scenario. And they said, of course we can do this. They said, zero-sum involves unnecessary trade-offs and false dichotomies. And it's as simple and as difficult as replacing the versus, one interest versus another, with and. Privacy and security, and privacy and marketing. Believe it or not, the Canadian Marketing Association, they have an annual conference every year, and they always invite me to be their keynote. And I always start by saying, I'm sure none of you want me to be here and want to hear the messaging I'm about to give you. I'm sure I'm the least popular speaker here. Fortunately, they laugh. And then they say, yeah, but we know we got to hear what you're saying. Because I always say privacy is not anti-marketing. It's pro-choice. You have to give the individual the choice as to how to go about doing their business. And I'm going to walk you through the 7 foundational principles of privacy by design, the essence. I've talked about a lot of these, so this won't take long. Be proactive so that you can prevent the harms from arising as opposed to just being remedial. Let me spend a minute on privacy as the default setting. This is absolutely critical. The prevailing model now is the opposite of this. They expect customers, users, to wade through all the legalese in the privacy policy, go through all the terms of service, looking for the opt-out clause that says, do not use my personal information for any purpose other than the primary purpose of the data collection. I mean, please, we know nobody does this. Nobody has time to do this. It takes hours and life is short, but it doesn't mean that people don't care deeply about privacy. In the last 2 years, privacy, concern for privacy has been at an all-time high in all the public opinion polls, Pew Research, etc. It comes in at the 90 percentile. 90% of those polled very concerned about their privacy. 92% concerned about loss of control over their personal information. This is huge. So people care deeply about privacy. Privacy as the default setting flips everything on its head. It says to customers, to users, you don't have to search for privacy protection. No, you don't have to do anything. We give it to you automatically. It's the default setting. We can only use your personal information for the primary purpose intended that you consented to. Apart from that, we can't use it. And if down the road, a secondary use arises that we would like to use your information for, we have to come back to you and seek your positive consent for the new use. This is a game changer, and it delivers loyalty and customer appeal like no other. It builds trusted business relationship with your customers. Companies that have gotten certified for privacy by design have come and told me that it's a game changer. It builds customer trust like nothing else, so that when they do go back, if they have a secondary use that they need to obtain additional consent for, they said they always get it. We always get consent because we've built that foundation of trust through privacy by design. So privacy as the default setting is huge. And as you heard, and you will hear a little further on, it's also been included in the EU's GDPR legislation, which is huge. Okay, privacy embedded in design. The reason that's important, embedding it, baking it into the code, is because you have to have a way of ensuring that it is seamlessly integrated into your operations. Not that someone has to think about it every time, or we got to add this. No, it's essential, it's embedded. I've talked about full functionality a lot, so I'm not going to continue to berate you with this, but it's so important. And let me just tell you a very quick story. When I was a graduate student at the University of Toronto in Canada, I was just in awe of Anatole Rappaport, who was a professor at the university at the time. He created game theory, which is where zero-sum positive sum comes from. And I remember I used to go and just fawn over him. And I remember asking him, I said, Professor Rappaport, why is everyone embracing zero sum? Positive sum makes so much more sense. You get two positive gains at the same time, not one versus the other. And he said, Anne, it's simple. Zero sum is the lazy man's way out. It's much easier just to have one interest versus another. But the end result of positive sum multiple gains is so much more far-reaching. So please remember his words, do not take the lazy man's way out. We can do positive sum, make it win-win. A word about security. While the term privacy subsumes a much broader set of protections than security alone, if you don't have a strong foundation of security these days from end to end with full lifecycle protection, in this day and age of daily cybersecurity attacks and phishing and everything, you're not going to have any privacy. You have to have a very strong foundation of security. Privacy and security, they go hand in hand. Visibility and transparency is so obvious to me, keeping it open to your data subjects. It's their personal information. They should have access to it. Companies who do this have also told me that it's a big win for them. Why? Because the information you have on your customers, since you have thousands of customers, you don't know if it's accurate or not. You can't check everything. Individuals can. The individual, by accessing their own personal information, will say, oh, no, that's wrong. I don't know where you got that from, or that's changed. So they correct the information you have on them, and it enhances the quality of all of your data. It's a total win-win. And finally, respect for user privacy, keeping it user-centric, so important. And it's not a big deal. If you keep it user-centric, all of this flows. So that's the essence of privacy by design. To me, it's like motherhood. Apparently, it's not like motherhood to most people, and we have to do this. And you might think, well, maybe this is interesting, but can't work in real life, right? It's too difficult. And au contraire. In the next slide, you'll see that we've operationalized privacy by design extensively. This was years ago. This is a compilation of 22 papers that we wrote with all of the major tech companies. Think of any major tech company: Microsoft, Intel, HPE, Oracle, IBM, of course, and I'm sure I'm leaving out a number of them. We partnered with them to produce 22 papers addressing these different areas because we wanted people to know mobile communications, remote home healthcare, surveillance, NFC, smart meters, and the smart grid, biometrics, of course, surveillance cameras. We can do this. We can do it all. It's so very, very important. I remember one paper we did with Intel on remote home healthcare. As you know, the population is aging. A lot of people are alone, living in their homes, and they want to stay in their homes, but they're alone. So they might need some assistance. Home healthcare, you agree to have certain aspects of your home with either a camera on it or some kind of device. So that, for example, if you get up in the middle of the night to use the restroom, but you don't return within a specified period of time, the sensor on your bed will let out an alarm to the 3 people you've agreed to be reached if there is a problem with your home, and then they can get you much needed care. Let's say you had a fall and you can't make it back to your bedroom and you need some assistance. This is huge, and Intel developed these amazing sensors, but the privacy protection on it was also huge, all by design. No one other than the people you had consented to would have access to the information under these conditions. Everything was by design. It's brilliant. It's worked so well. That's just one example. We can do this in multiple different areas. And in the next slide, I love this. I got this shortly after I left being commissioner on my 3rd term. And the Japanese, I thought, if they can understand these terms, surely the rest of us can. They said, you know, privacy by design is considered to be one of the most important concepts by JIPTEC, the Japanese Information Processing Development Center. And they said, we've heard from Japan's private sector companies that we need to insist on the principle of positive sum, not zero sum, and become enlightened with privacy by design. I love this. This touched me so deeply because I figured if the Japanese, whose English isn't their first language, they understand the value of positive sum versus zero sum, then surely the rest of us can grasp this. So these are some of the things. Now, people might say, well, what's this going to cost me? You know, this is going to cost me a lot, isn't it? Of course, there is some cost associated with doing privacy by design proactively, but I want to assure you, it is a fraction of the cost you will incur when you have a data breach or a privacy infraction, which I assure you you will if you don't do proactive measures. And these days, they're no longer just lawsuits, they're class action lawsuits that can cost you millions of dollars, honestly. But the damage to your brand, the damage to your reputation may be irreparable, because the loss of consumer confidence and trust, once that's out the door, you're not going to get it back. There's a store called Target in the US, which a number of years ago came to Canada. I was very excited because, as I said, we have a place in Arizona, and I love going to Target in Arizona. So when we got a Target in Canada, I was very excited. But several years ago, there was a major privacy breach in Target. And the president of the Target in the US, they resigned. The president of Target Canada was fired. And within a few months, there was no more Targets in Canada. Consumer confidence went out the door, and we just lost our Targets here in Canada, which is so unfortunate. But these kind of things happen all the time. And, you know, I try to drive it home that the cost associated with doing privacy by design upfront is so minimal, especially if by any chance you're a startup. It's like costs virtually nothing because you're starting up, and it's just how you frame your operations. If you're not a startup, you've been around a long time, don't worry, we can do it from now going forward. You don't have to undo all the damage you've done in the past. Start now on a go forward basis. Be proactive, embed privacy protective measures into the design of your operations. We can do this, and you will gain enormous benefits by doing so. Now, in the next slide, I talk about the General Data Protection Regulation, which came into effect in 2018. The GDPR strengthens privacy dramatically. It gives citizens control over their personal data in ways that was non-existent before. And if you recall, I talked about how critical, absolutely essential personal control is to privacy. And it's embedded in the GDPR. And countries all around the world are trying to mirror the GDPR so they can engage in trade easily with all of Europe, which is what everyone's goal is. It's wonderful. And the next slide, this was my delight. In addition to all the things I said about the GDPR, they added the language of privacy by design as data protection by design, and privacy is the default directly into the law, Article 25. And I should tell you, in North America, we're called privacy commissioners. In Europe, they're data protection commissioners, but it's the exact same thing. And including privacy as data protection by design and default in the EU GDPR is just huge, absolutely huge. And it's made it grow dramatically. In the next slide, now I want to make it clear, I would not be so bold as to say this, but Information Age a number of years ago said that it's not too much of a stretch to say that if you implement privacy by design, you've mastered the GDPR. And to be clear, there's way more to the GDPR than privacy by design or data protection by design. I assure you of that. But the point that was being made here was that privacy by design delivers such strength in terms of privacy and data protection that if you follow it, you're probably following a number of the other requirements of the GDPR relating to this. In Canada, I'm embarrassed to say, we don't have it in our legislation yet, despite the efforts of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, which you'll see in the next slide. Years ago, several years ago, he said, look, for goodness sake, it was developed by Anne Cavoukian, one of ours, a Canadian, and they've included it in the EU law. We have to include it in our law. We need to upgrade privacy by design. We need to upgrade our privacy law, PIPEDA, for private sector privacy here in Canada, and we need to add privacy by design so we can be essentially equivalent to the EU, and we can engage in trade with them without any concern. We've always been able to do that in the past, but we were no longer essentially equivalent to them after the GDPR came into effect. So the next, in response to this, in 2018, the federal government published a paper called Towards Privacy by Design. And we were all very optimistic that they were leaning in the direction of upgrading our dated federal private sector legislation from the early 2000s. It needed to be upgraded anyway and have some teeth added to it, and also to add privacy by design. So we were very optimistic. Need I say, you need to walk your talk, and our government, our federal government in Canada, has not walked its talk, much to my disappointment. There's been no change to the federal private sector legislation, no addition of privacy by design, nothing. So I want to be very clear. You don't just have to worry about businesses not offering strong privacy protection. Government is often one of the weakest in this area. So don't think that, oh, the government's taking care of everything. They should be, but they're not. So in response to this, we've been offering privacy by design certification. I do it with KPMG. And the reason we're doing this is because so many companies have come to me. That's why I started my own consulting firm last year. Companies kept coming to me and said, please offer us your consulting services. We need your help. And let's do, let's have something that shows that I'm doing privacy by design properly. So I worked with KPMG to add privacy by design certification in terms of all the certifications that they do. And this has been really, really important because companies that have become certified for privacy by design have had such success. They come back to me all the time and they say, amazing, absolutely amazing, the success we've had with PBD certification. Our customers love us. They just give us all of their repeat business. There's loyalty like no other, and it attracts new opportunity. We're getting new customers. We are in the driver's seat, and we love it, and we're strongly protecting everyone's personal information. So that's my very exciting news about privacy by design certification. Tell companies that if they're doing PBD and they want to be certified, contact me. I'll connect them with KPMG, and they'll be in the driver's seat. In the next slide, this was a number of years ago where there was a reference to the EU GDPR, privacy by design being included, which is very exciting. And they also include a reference to a new global privacy and security focus that I have adopted, which you'll see on the next slide. It's all about global privacy and security experts launching an international council on global privacy and security by design. And we decided to do this so we can get this into the private sector widely. Darren Entwistle is the CEO of TELUS, one of our major telcos here in Canada. These are the amazing people who, when I contacted them, would they consider being on the board? They said yes right away. So I'm so grateful to Darren Entwistle. Michael Chertoff, who needs no introduction. He was the second Secretary of U.S. Homeland Security. He said yes right away. Of course I want to do this. Gilles de Kerchove, Director of EU Counterterrorism. He said, of course, I'd be delighted. We need both privacy and security. It can't be one versus the other. Greg Wolfon, CEO of SecureKey, a major company in this area. Joseph Samitian, he was the supervisor of Santa Clara County and the former chair of the California State Senate Select Committee on Privacy. Totally, all these wonderful people said yes right away. And that's why I get so excited whenever you think, oh, maybe it's not going to happen. Things can happen all the time. So again, our focus is privacy and security, not one versus the other, and making it a doubly enabling positive sum approach, abandoning zero sum in favor of positive sum. We can do this. So anytime people tell you, forget it, that ship has sailed, it's dead, you challenge them, you say, the hell with it. Right, use better language than that. Do not think this is dead. Privacy is just beginning to grow, and this will continue to grow. Now, I'm going to turn next to and this is just, I'm also offering a course on privacy by design online. And next month, I'm actually going to be offering a new course called Trust by Design, because trust, there's such a trust deficit right now, and we need to build trust. And it's an extension of my global privacy by design framework. So in the next slide, you'll see I'm going to switch to facial recognition now and talk about facial recognition for the next 10, 20 minutes, and then I'll end by talking about COVID-19 and how we need to arm ourselves to ensure that privacy is preserved despite this pandemic. So in the next slide, I talk about facial recognition. So many problems with facial recognition. First of all, it's largely invisible. You rarely know it's operating because it's usually operating in the background. There's a CCTV camera somewhere, and you don't know about it. And the worst thing is your facial image is the most sensitive biometric in existence. It deserves the strongest protection possible, not just operating in the background, grabbing your face. It's appalling. And I worry about this so much because I'll tell you stories a little later on about what this can do in terms of identity theft. And it's just huge. When I was privacy commissioner, so many victims of identity theft came to me. I'll tell you more about that. In the next slide, I talk about the US, where facial recognition is coming to airports in the US, of course. But let me make something clear. Let me distinguish between the two types of facial recognition. There's one-to-one comparisons and one-to-many. One-to-one is fine. I have an Access card because I used to travel when one could travel into the US all the time for speaking engagements, etc. One-to-one means your live face is compared to a picture of your face that appears, for example, on your passport. So your live face is compared to your picture, and if it's a one-to-one comparison, and if it matches, you're good to go. One-to-one is wonderful because it's totally under your control. You have consented to it, given positive consent to your facial image connecting with the picture that you have consented to that appears in your passport. One-to-one is fine. One-to-many comparisons is what we're talking about here by facial recognition. One-to-many means all the CCTV cameras that are bound. I mean, in the UK, there's like 4.2 million CCTV cameras, and they compare your facial image as you're walking down the street to a whole thousands, hundreds of thousands of facial images they have to see if you're the bad guy they're looking for, the person of interest. The thing you have to know is that facial recognition has the worst accuracy imaginable. In the UK, where I mentioned the millions and millions of cameras, there's an 81% false positive rate. 81% of the facial images that are compared falsely identify you as the person of interest they're looking for. Can you imagine 81% saying my face is the bad guy? Appalling. And there's no point in even using it. Let me just continue with my slides and I'll keep talking. It's also come into Canada as well. And as I mentioned to you, one-to-one comparison, no problem. That's going to take place and it will be to your advantage. Again, it's all positive consent. But the one-to-many is where you have to be so concerned. In the next slide, I talk about facial recognition applications. And here's one example that happened in Canada, in Alberta. There's a mall, a big mall called Cadillac Fairview. They're all across Canada. But in the one in Alberta, what people were noticing was when they went to a kiosk to ask, where's this in this store, they noticed that somehow their facial image is being captured at the kiosk. And they haven't consented to this. They weren't notified of this. Zero control. And hundreds of complaints went to the Federal Privacy Commissioner and said, why the heck are they capturing my face without my consent, without anything? And people stopped going to this Cadillac Fairview Mall. That's the problem. You're going to lose business if you don't protect privacy, especially if you go about doing so in this backwards manner. So Cadillac Fairview, thank God, stopped the facial images, the facial recognition, until the Federal Privacy Commissioner makes a ruling on all the complaints he's received. But it's appalling they would do this. I gave you the comparison, 81% inaccuracy, false positives in the UK. There was a report that came out just 2 months ago in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. They found that 96% of their facial recognition matches were false positives. 96%. Can you imagine? I mean, why bother doing this? It's especially inaccurate for people of color, Black individuals, etc. But it's a huge inaccuracy rate. And that's what is so appalling about this, is why you would allow this to continue. It's just staggering, and we have to bring an end to it. And fortunately, in the United States, especially a number of states, a number of cities, San Diego, Texas, Oakland, a number of them are outright banning facial recognition completely. They're saying, given all the false positives, there's no point in doing this. Let me mention this about identity theft. When I was commissioner, as I said, a number of individuals came to me who were victims of identity theft, seeking my help. And they said, look, these credit card companies, they keep telling me I got to pay up for all these charges. And we keep telling them that wasn't me. I didn't rack up those charges. That was someone who stole my identity. But they don't believe me. So I said, the first thing you do is you go to the police and make sure you file an occurrence report. That way, it's a reflection that you have claimed that your identity was stolen and have gone to the police to indicate that and seek their assistance. And then I would help them as best I could to retrieve their identity. And it's very, very difficult to do. And they were plagued with this sometimes for years. This is what is so appalling with facial recognition, that it results in this kind of horrible identity theft, etc. And we have to keep moving forward. But for every negative, there's a positive. There's an amazing Israeli company called DID. And what they do is they protect your facial identity from face recognition technologies. It is fabulous. I work with them very strongly. And what they have found is that the risk of privacy, of course, escalates dramatically as more and more systems are adopting facial recognition these days. And all organizations that handle these images, governments, corporations, security agencies, they face growing challenges involving regulatory requirements and sensitive security issues. There's so much that's going on. DID is an amazing company that, in the next slide, they have groundbreaking technology that produces images that are unrecognizable to facial recognition algorithms while keeping them similar to the human eye. So if you were looking at my face, you would still be able to tell this is an image of Cavoukian. But the facial recognition algorithm would not be able to do that based on their technology. So their facial distortion is specifically designed to make it difficult for AI to overcome. It's absolutely brilliant. And I like to offer my assistance to them every time I can, because it will give you some sense of, we can't keep doing this. This is the example I want to give. At the beginning, I said, look, for every negative, there's a positive that can arise. And there are going to be more and more negatives like this, but the negative being facial recognition. But the positive is companies like DID. And I should also tell you, major companies, Microsoft, IBM, I think it was Amazon, they're now banning facial recognition, banning it outright because of all the false positive and inaccuracy. So you see, every time it's like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But whenever there is growth like this, we can do something about it. And I'm sure you've all heard about Clearview AI, this horrible company that basically slurped 3.3 billion facial images from social media like Facebook and others, and they sell it to law enforcement agencies. Now in Canada, several law enforcement agencies has quietly bought this technology from Clearview AI without their police commissioners knowing about it. When I learned about this here in Canada, in Toronto, and went to the police commissioner at the time, as soon as he learned about it, he shut it down. He didn't know his staff had bought this technology, and he shut it down. And that was the story all across Canada, that once the head of the police agencies learned that they had bought this kind of technology from Clearview AI, who clearly wasn't authorized to have the data, let alone sell it, they shut it down. So again, for every negative story, there's a positive. Don't give up hope. Never, ever give up hope. I'm going to end by talking about COVID just for a few minutes in the next couple of slides. In the next slide, I talk about the push to contact tracing. Let me just spend a moment on this. Whenever there is an emergency, a crisis of any kind, 9/11, SARS, COVID-19, you always have the zero-sum model being invoked of forget about privacy, we need public safety, of course. Of course we need public safety, but not at the expense of privacy. You don't have to give up privacy in order to have public safety. You can have both. You must have both. And I love this letter. This came out early in the year. 300 experts, epidemiologists from all around the world, 26 countries, globally signed a joint letter warning everyone, governments, that unless governments build contact tracing technology in a privacy protective manner, it will fail, full stop. That's what they said. Because you see, it's absolutely vital that individuals' privacy be protected as well as having contact tracing. You can't create contact tracing apps that don't protect privacy because otherwise they're going to be repurposed and it will enable unwarranted discrimination and surveillance. It's vital that we not create a tool that enables large-scale data collection on the entire population now or at any later time. And these experts and epidemiologists, these aren't privacy experts. The doctors, epidemiologists, physicians, etc. And they get it right away. I was so delighted when I saw this, and I use this in all of, I do a ton of media interviews every day, and especially at the beginning, March, April. This was such a huge story. Well, we got to trace people. No, you don't. In the next slide, there was another letter as well, this time from the UK, 177 cybersecurity experts, again, warning the British government that contact tracing app could be used to surveil people even after the coronavirus has ended. And Britain, the UK, in addition to Australia, was one of the ones that started with a contact tracing app that was, in fact, privacy invasive. It was appalling. It could trace people and engage in surveillance. They had to ditch it and use the following one. There is an amazing contact tracing, actually they call it in the next slide. It's surveillance, it's not called contact tracing, it's called exposure notification API. Apple and Google partnered together, which they rarely do, and they did this because most of the people with mobile phones have either an iPhone or an Android. So they partnered together to create an API, a framework that could be used by both iPhone and Androids. It was amazing. And they called it an exposure notification framework because they didn't want people to think it was tracing, contact tracing them, engaging in surveillance. No, what it does, and it's totally privacy protective. Let me lead with that. Apple briefed me on 2 separate occasions, and they walked me through all of the code. Because you see, they know me, and they know I always look under the hood. You know, I always say trust but verify. You always have to make sure that they're walking the talk. So they, on 2 separate occasions, walked me through all of this and all of the code of this framework. There's nothing that collects any personal information. Your privacy remains completely intact. No personal information is collected, no geolocation data, nothing. And it's entirely under your control. You choose whether to download this app. And if you download it, what it will do is it will alert you to anyone within 6 feet of you or 2 meters who has self-reported as being COVID-19 positive. Then you can decide what to do. Do you want to go to your family doctor? Do you want to go to a public health authority to be tested? It's entirely up to you. No one knows anything. If you choose to do nothing, nothing happens. Everything is entirely under your control. That's what I love about the Apple Google framework. And in Ontario, Canada, where I am, I worked with the government to ensure that they developed, it's called COVID Alert app. It's not called a contact tracing app. It is an exposure notification app based on the Apple Google framework. And I know it collects no personal information whatsoever. It's amazing. And this is what I'm encouraging people to consider using and downloading the COVID alert that we've developed here in Ontario, which has been taken by Canada and applied across the country in Canada. And in both, as I said, the UK and Australia, they started out with personally identifiable surveillance kind of apps. They had to ditch it. They're now using the Apple Google framework. And I should tell you, about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, Germany, they made their contact tracing app based on the Apple Google framework. And within 24 hours, they had 6.5 million people download the app within 24 hours. Because in Germany, as I said, they have the strongest privacy laws and data protection commissioner in existence. And the people who live there know that. So they trust the government and trust that privacy will be strongly protected in here, which it totally, totally is. So that's what I want you to know. There are things available. And you see, Apple Google made it also very clear that this exposure notification app, which as I said is called COVID Alert here in Canada, but many jurisdictions use it, it's intended to complement manual contact tracing done by your public health authority. Public health has always engaged in contact tracing. So if you go to the public health authority and you test positive for COVID, they're going to say to you, okay, who were you with in the last 2 weeks? Tell us all the individuals you came into contact with, etc. And we'll contact them and encourage them to be tested. It's intended to complement manual contact tracing. Again, multiple positive gains, not one interest versus another. You have to do both. You can do both. So please consider downloading COVID Alert or whatever the Apple Google framework app is in your jurisdiction. And it's entirely your choice. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. It's you decide. You are in control. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me end in my last slide by just reminding you that privacy and security risks are best protected, managed by embedding the principles of privacy by design to prevent the privacy harms from arising. If you focus on prevention, it's much easier and far more cost-effective to embed both privacy and security up front rather than having to deal with this after the fact. And it reflects the most ethical treatment of personal data. So get rid of zero-sum thinking, embrace doubly enabling systems of positive sum, multiple positive gains, privacy and data utility, privacy and security. And as one of my European colleagues told me a long time ago, he said, you know, if people are smart, they'll lead with privacy by design. But most people, you know, they're not there. Most governments and companies just leave privacy to be protected by chance or worse, by disaster when you have a privacy impediment and a data breach. So avoid that, embed privacy by design, and then get a win-win. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. In the next slide, if you have any interest in following me on Twitter, As I said, I tweet every morning the latest stories, groundbreaking stories, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne, and apologies for not going to that last slide. I forgot it was in the deck. We've just heard a masterclass on this amazing privacy by design, this going away from the zero-sum game, and this importance of, if you want to survive, embed privacy, be compliant with regulation, go even beyond that. And I think you've started like this revolution. Every time now we hear about by design, it's trust by design as you're coming up with your new certification course. We've got democracy by design. We've got engineering by design. We've got all of these concepts now, which is about not paying lip service to this notion of privacy and security, not bolting it on after the design process has occurred, but embedding it in the functional specification of this wonderful thing called innovation. We'd love to thank you. It's the first full-length lecture we've had at the Colloquium, but there's so much in there. I'm hoping to make the slides available to our participants, but I just really want to give you like 2 minutes to catch your breath. And in the meantime, I know that the questions are coming through. We've got a lot of amazing people. I'm going to introduce some of them, and perhaps we've got a moment to give Dr. Anne Cavoukian a breath. If we can go through and just, if you want to unmute and say a few words about who you are, just so Anne has a context for your questions. AfriCause Inc. Did you want to say anything? Feel free to share your video and your audio. We'll go to Professor Andreas Spañas from Arizona State University. Andreas, I'm not sure if you're online at the moment or you've taken a break, but feel free to introduce your laboratory. And I'll say a few words, Anne, for each of the people that I know, just in case they are taking a bathroom break. Okay, Andreas, over to you. Your audio, Andrew. Desakume, Andrew, your audio. There you go.
Okay, it wasn't allowing me to unmute. I just want to say hi and thank you. Great talk and I think important stuff. I invited three of our industry partners. I don't know if they logged on, but it was a great talk. Thank you, Anne, and thanks, Katina. I'm a professor in electrical engineering and sensor signal information processing director of a center here. So the talk was very relevant to the social and privacy side of what we do.
Thanks, Andreas.
Thank you.
We'll go to Caroline Kuhn. I don't know if you wanted to unmute, Caroline, or share your video. We can hear you, Caroline. I think Caroline might be typing a message to us. She doesn't realize she's unmuted. We'll go to Diana Madril, who I had the pleasure of talking to on the phone earlier this week. Diana, did you want to say anything as a matter of introduction? So,
yes, I'm sorry. I
go
just
ahead, Diana.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate all that you had said, Anne, and you definitely motivate me, and I thank you for giving me hope that this is actually happening, and I appreciate all that you do to protect us individuals and in this invisible world where a lot of us can't see that. And it's been a privilege to be in this virtual room, and I appreciate all that you do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. We've also got Dr. Robert Abbas, who can't speak at the moment, from Wollongong, Australia, who's from the University of Wollongong and actually does work on a lot of COVID-safe applications in Australia, looking at technological responses to the reduction of the transmission and Dr. Abbas has cited your work extensively in the past and has a question, but we might go also to Jason Sargent. I don't know, Jason, if you're available.
Yeah, good morning, Katina. Good morning, Anne. So I'm Jason Sargent from Swinburne University in Melbourne. Got the video off because this is a bit like confession. It's been 6 months since my last haircut, so I'll keep the video off. And I teach a couple of units, professional issues in IT, so we use your work at least once a semester for undergrad and postgrad. And also, I'm the co-director of the Information Systems, the Social Impact Research Group. And so we look at privacy in one particular field at the moment, and that's with Somalia and digital ID. It's one of our projects. So just again, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure just to log on and to listen to you in person.
Thank you.
And we've also got, I think it's Teresa Anderson, whom we've recently been acquainted together with. Is that Teresa?
Yes, it is. Yes. And I have a similar confession in terms of haircuts and it being an early morning here in Sydney. But I appreciated having the option of I'll put a nice avatar on next time. But this has just been an absolute delight to listen to. And I was so touched by your story because in some really powerful ways, it is similar to the story of my parents and the diaspora that led to them fleeing Central Europe. And you've just inspired me to make that story more public. So I have to this point shared, and I wanted to flag to you, I think the way that you tell this strikes me as so resonant with the approach of Indigenous science and ways of moving forward and starting not from positions of authority, but from positions of personal story. And that seems a really critical way of keeping the human in all of our conversations and helping people to see that you speak to them not over them, but with them. So thank you so much for modeling that, and in, as you said, really, really encouraging everyone. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Teresa. I really wanted to take this opportunity, and it's not often that you actually mingle with your participants and get to hear what they think about your talk. Often, you're thrust into a presentation, you've got an appointment next, and you go. But this is all about the colloquium. We're trying to develop a community of practice. I want to go to a wonderful young lady who's enrolled in our Masters of Science in Public Interest Technology, Toby Shurif. I don't know if you wanted to share some of your background and your specific work that you'll be presenting at EastTest this year.
Thank you so much, Katina. And I'm taking my privacy sticker off of my webcam there now. But it is just so thrilling to have heard your talk today, Dr. Cavoukian. I have to tell you that for the past 20 years, I have been working at the intersection of technology with domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking. And your work, this concept of privacy by design, is absolutely central to the work that we do. And we are constantly promoting it as we speak with funding agencies, with the whole network of criminal justice and legal systems that are seeking to support victims, and that so many people feel that because survivors of violence are receiving services or benefits or assistance, or that people who are homeless are receiving that somehow they therefore have no right over to their own privacy, their own information. And so your work is so foundational to helping to really share why it is so important that people, even when they are receiving assistance, right, have still control over their own information, their own privacy. So thank you so much for your work.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful what you're doing.
Niels Keefe, I know we've spoken a lot about your work. Did you want to talk a little bit about what you do in your organization? I don't know, Neil. Yes, go ahead.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Oh, and thanks for your talk. It was really inspiring. Also because of GDPR. I'm a senior user experience designer, so I'm not. I'm on the design side of things, and I would like to ask you a question, if that's okay. Because in computer science, obviously things are centralized at the moment, but in the near future, it will be decentralized by the use of blockchain. And if code becomes law, principles become really, really important. So perhaps you have some thoughts on that perspective?
If I could, may I respond, Katina?
Yes, I think we're going to start opening introductions and questions now that we've given you a break to get your breath. So go ahead, Anne. Thank you.
I just want to respond by talking about, thank you for raising the question of centralization versus decentralization. I'm working with Microsoft now and foundations called the Decentralized Identity Foundation. And it works everywhere, Microsoft, IBM, others are all participating in this. And the goal is to decentralize identity so that individuals have control over their personal identity, which is like one of the most important aspects of privacy. And the fact that major companies like Microsoft and IBM and others are supporting this just makes my heart sing. And that there is a decentralized identity foundation already consisting of lots of partners and talking about verifiable credentials and how do you do this. So I'm very optimistic that we will get to increasingly to a decentralized model where your personal identity isn't in the hands of the major companies and their centralized databases, Google, Facebook, etc., and you have no control. No, we're going to try to return control back to the individual relating to their identity through verifiable credentials that reside with the individual under their control. So I'm very excited about this.
Amazing. Thank you.
We're going to go to Tara. Tara, you had a question according to the chat. We'll just double check that Tara Heston is still on with us. Go ahead, Tara. Tara may have taken a break. I want to go to a question that was posed by Dr. Roba Abbas, and it was to do with the end of your presentation. And she says, thank you for the brilliant presentation, Dr. Cavoukian. You mentioned the importance of adopting a positive sum approach in the design of emerging technologies. Recently, and in the context of COVID-19 contact tracing apps, more specifically, we've witnessed some governments and other stakeholders adopting a zero-sum argument, i.e., safety versus privacy, as opposed to and. It would be wonderful to hear your practical recommendations in terms of encouraging or facilitating a shift from zero-sum to positive-sum mindset that is commonly adopted, specifically in the context of this pandemic.
And that has been happening everywhere, unfortunately. In the early days of COVID, March, April, so here in Canada and Ontario, our privacy laws have a clause for emergencies like this that can be invoked to enable the government and public health authorities to make use of personal information that they normally wouldn't have been entitled to. So this is happening everywhere. And it's as you mentioned, it's public health is more important than privacy. We have to stay safe. And it erodes the notion that you can do both. You must have public health and privacy. And this is so important. I'll give you one example of why it doesn't work when you impose it on people. Here in Toronto, Canada, which is where I am, they impose this requirement that if you go to a restaurant, they opened up restaurants. The phase one, they were closed. There was no in-restaurant dining. Now they're allowing it. But when you go to the restaurant, you have to give your name and your contact information where you can be contacted if something goes awry and someone has COVID. The problem is everyone's giving out false information. No one wants to give their accurate information because they don't know what's going to happen to it. And restaurants are supposed to protect it and keep it very secure, destroy it within 30 days securely. They don't know how to do that. I mean, that's not the business they're engaged in. So unfortunately, the public health requirement is resulting in zero help because people are falsifying information. And that's what happens when you impose these egregious requirements on individuals. People want to be able to go out and dine and hang out with whoever they want to hang out with without being traced all over the place. So my recommendation to the government was, if they're going to a restaurant, don't make them give this information out. What I would urge you to tell them is say, we would like you to consider downloading the COVID Alert app. It's been developed based on the Apple Google framework. It's totally privacy protective. If you download it, it will alert you to whether you've been in contact with someone within 6 feet who is COVID-19 positive. So it will achieve the same goal, but much better in a totally privacy protective way. That's the way forward, in my view, as opposed to the zero useful way of having all this false information, because people don't want to tell you they were out with so-and-so on such and such a night and at such and such a place. I mean, please, people should be able to dine privately and not have to reveal the information. So that's just one example. We have to constantly tell the governments that you cannot do this. You can't just impose collecting everyone's personal information and telling them, well, don't worry, it's going to be safe afterwards. Are you kidding me? Usually when personal information is collected, that practice continues well after the emergency incident has ended. And so just keep going back to them and saying, with respect, we don't like the zero-sum mindset. You're going to collect all this personal information, but here's alternatives that we can offer you that we believe offer better solutions for both public health and privacy.
That's great. And I know Dr. Abbas will be extremely happy to hear that response and will utilize it, I'm sure, in future presentations. We've got Stephen Wally, who's asking a question next. And Stephen, you may want to introduce yourself too.
Hi, thanks, Katrina, and thanks, Dr. Cavoukian. So I was invited by Professor Spanias from ASU. I worked with him on some of his sensor work and machine learning. I spent many years at Intel, 20 plus years at Intel, working on bus structures like USB and PCI Express, so I got very involved in security. So good to hear some of the positive things you said about Intel. I was also extremely happy with the talk because I've attended many security and privacy conferences, and they're so depressing. They're so, talking about all the bad things that are going on with privacy and security, and very much observing the problem, but not getting into specifics about what we should do about them. So it was nice to see, somebody actually putting a lot of focus on what do we do about these problems. And so my quick question is, at the moment, I'm kind of an independent consultant working on edge computing. So sensing right at the edge where you're taking data in and you want to compute on that data before you transfer all the data up to the cloud, say. And what we're trying to do is make it as secure as possible when that data comes in. And also, just to complicate matters more, we use machine learning. It could be artificial intelligence as well. And obviously those concepts have human biases into them. As people write algorithms, whether if I'm doing an automated autonomous vehicle, which way should I go? Do I knock grandma over, or do I knock the child over in the road, etc.? And I just wondered, have you looked at the biases in people and how that impacts security and privacy? Thank you.
That's a very good point, Stephen. The biases are obviously in existence, and detecting them and addressing them can be extremely difficult. I am not personally involved in research in that area, how to address biases, etc. But the fact that you raise them is very, very important. This can work both either in favor or to the detriment of the individuals involved, and clearly has to be addressed. So I wish I had a better answer for you, because I do not. But I would love you to keep me informed of any advances you make in that area, because I would love to learn about how to address these issues as well. So I do apologize that I don't have an answer for you.
Okay, thanks.
Keep me
I know.
posted.
Sorry to interrupt there, Anne. I know the group very well, the Sensitive group. I'm a member of that group with Andreas Spanias hosting that and being the director, but they're doing a lot of work in the space of tiny machine learning, looking at edge computing, looking at all these privacy impacts. I think one of the great examples is what you spoke about with Sidewalk Labs. And I think the de-identification at the source. I heard one of your Bloomberg interviews, which I'll put up on the webpage as a link to, but you really said it well there, that we de-identify at the source and ensure that we go forward from there. I like that kind of approach.
Thank you so much. Could I speak to that?
Yes, please.
Katina?
Please, Anne.
People are always surprised when I work with companies that they think should be the enemy. So when Sidewalk Labs, an Alphabet company, came to me, they were hired, they got the successful contract for building a smart city in Toronto, Canada, which is where I reside. And they came to me and they said, we want to make sure in our smart city, we have privacy by design. We want to follow privacy by design. So we want to hire you as our consultant to make that happen. And I was delighted, because I always say, look, if someone wants to turn a corner and go in the direction of privacy, you say, yes, let me help you. Not, well, forget about it. You didn't do privacy in the past, so I'm never going to help you. Absurd. So I said, of course, I'm happy to help you. But I also said to them, I need to warn you, I'll be a thorn in your side if you don't do privacy by design the way it's intended, which is why you hired me. And they said, that's why we hired you. We're going to do privacy by design. That's what we intend to do. So great. It was a win-win at the beginning. And when I looked at how smart cities work, and there's all this technology gathering all kinds of information 24/7 over which you have no control, that's when I came up with the position that we have to de-identify all data at source, meaning the minute your technology picks up something, anyone traveling down a street or whatever, any information that is collected through whatever technology you have in place, we have to immediately strip all personal identifiers right at the time it's collected at source, and then you can do whatever you want with the information. That's the beauty of it. You're then free to do whatever you want with the information. So they were all in agreement with that. We're going to de-identify data at source, make it a win-win, etc. And everything was fine until Jim Balsillie started being very critical of Sidewalk Labs and Alphabet and saying, yeah, but why should they be the one who engages in how to decide what to do with the data, the governance issues associated with the data? Why should they, Sidewalk Labs, be in control of that? So Sidewalk Labs, in response to that, said, okay, we'll set up a trust consisting of multiple parties, including the provincial government, the municipal government, us, and whatever companies are involved in delivering the technology for our smart city. And then they said the following, and this is why I had to resign. They said, and they didn't, this is the only thing they didn't consult with me on because they knew what I would say. They said, of course, we will encourage companies who work with us to de-identify data at source, but we can't make them do that. They can do whatever they want. I knew when they said that, it would mean that no data would be de-identified at source. It was just throwing away the baby with the bathwater, and it wasn't going to happen. So the next morning, I submitted my resignation, and they all went nuts. I remember Dan Doctoroff in New York City called me, and everybody, why are you resigning? I said, because you never talked to me about this. And had you talked to me, you would have known, as you of course did know, because that's why you didn't talk to me, that this would be untenable. And what I also said was, if you had talked to me about this, I would have said, give me 1 week. Let me go to the City of Toronto, which was the governing body, and let me convince them to say, if you want to work with us to develop this smart city to all the tech companies, then you must de-identify data at source. I know I could get the City of Toronto, their board, to agree to that. And then we would still have multiple parties involving in governance, which is what you wanted, and we would have them all agreeing to de-identify data at source. You don't just say, well, it's up to you if you want to do it. It's nonsense. No one's going to do it like that. Anyway, they didn't have faith in me to do that, and I resigned, and there's no Sidewalk Labs contract anymore. It's gone. So I raise that as an example of why we have to reject the defeatist attitude that, well, it's going to have to be this way because, they're Alphabet or they're whoever. No, it doesn't have to be that way. We can find solutions that address multiple interests at the same time. You don't give up. Sorry, back to you, Katina.
That's great. I had listened to a talk once that was talking about pre-processing, that they would still collect at the source and then they'd pre-process and chuck it out and then continue on. But I kind of like what you're saying. Just don't collect it in the first place. At the source, get rid of personally identifiable information. And I also loved at the end of that Bloomberg interview, what you said was, it's not like I'm fighting a smart city. You want Toronto to be first and foremost on the world, landscape of best places to visit, most convenient, and perhaps most privacy enhancing, if we take your angle. But this is the thing. Often there's a student in this room at the moment, Miss Elma Hayrick, who's in a smart city infrastructure and technology course I'm teaching. Elma, I'm not sure if you're able to unmute, but I know Elma's PhD is on the theme of data ownership, and I know she was very touched by your opening remarks, but I'll just let her introduce herself and respond to that smart infrastructure context.
Hi, I'm Elma Hayrick. I'm a PhD student interested in smart cities and data ownership, as Katina mentioned. And yes, I was very touched by your opening remarks because I'm originally from Bosnia, so there's also a genocide there, and that element that I resonate with very much. And I appreciate you being here. I did have a question on possible governance structures and what your opinion was on data trust in general versus a legislation approach, like a comprehensive legislation.
Of course. I'm all in favor of data trust. It's all a matter of how it's structured and the expectations created. Because, expecting government to do everything, and you heard my comments about government earlier. I worked when I was privacy commissioner for 3 terms, each of the terms there was a different political party in place as the government. And before they became the government, they were all in favor of privacy and strongly protecting data, et cetera. Then they became the government and everything changed. They wanted to control the data. So I'm not very trustful of government. So the data trust, I think, is an excellent model, but it depends on how it's structured and the expectations created and the requirements to protect privacy. That was my objection with the data trust created by Alphabet Sidewalk Labs in Toronto for the smart city, because they just threw it away. They just said, okay, forget it. You can do whatever you want, your private sector companies. No, you don't do that. You say, great, we want companies. We want you to work with us. And here are the minimal requirements. You're going to have invaluable data that is created in a smart city. We're going to ask to strip the data, the personal data at source in terms of protecting privacy, but then you're going to have massive, wonderful wealth of data. And we can decide how best to orchestrate that and put it to use and the ways in which the terms and conditions, we can decide all that, but you need some ground rules. And that's the only thing I objected to in terms of privacy and the lack thereof, and the lack of any ground rules. The Alphabet just basically gave it away, and they didn't have to.
Thank you, Anne. Our first keynote for this whole colloquium series is online. That's Miss Jumana Abugazela, and she's from Pivot Humanity. She runs Pivot Humanity, and I wanted to give her the floor, if that's okay, Jumana.
Of course.
Oh, I'm in the witness protection program, which is good because I also haven't had a haircut in a very long time. But thank you for, can you hear me? Okay.
All perfect, Jumana. Yes, and we can see your shadow, but okay. We are so grateful you're online, Boston time.
Wonderful. Thank you for this brilliant talk. Dr. Cavoukian, you've done the really heavy lifting work and taken us from, let's use the alphabet as a spectrum from A to Q. And I'm interested in your thoughts on how we get from Q to Z. So if A is, no security, no privacy, and Q is, all the way to privacy by design, how do we get that? How do we get past the place where privacy by design is on an ad hoc basis, certain companies and certain people and certain teams and certain products, from that to something that is universal, so that there are a set of norms and standards, and that's baked into how individuals across the board, from design to engineering to management, are applying privacy by design and trust by design principles to their work every day. And what mechanisms do you see? As we know, we're not waiting for the government but what another, a metaphor might be like, how can we make a privacy by design sandwich so that the one piece of the bread is the incentives that are given to the individuals building and developing the products, and the other piece of bread is, the consequences or attendant, like the enforcement mechanisms that need to be in place in order for privacy by design to actually be all that it can be for society.
I love the sandwich idea. I love that. Thank you so much. Privacy by design, and how do we make sure it gets enforced, etc. It's a very good question. The only thing we've had thus far, but it's had a huge impact, is the GDPR in terms of adding privacy by design, data protection by design, and as the default. And so many companies globally from around the world are trying now to engage in privacy by design so that they can satisfy the GDPR and engage in trade with the EU. Having legislation in place is very helpful in terms of the requirement, if you will, for privacy by design that may not have been there otherwise. But then companies have to basically take it up and offer the best solutions that incorporate privacy by design. That's why I love working with companies directly, because once they get the need for privacy by design, which may have been generated from the GDPR or other instruments, then they get excited when they understand that this can work in their favor. I've talked to a lot of companies, I've talked to a lot of boards of directors, and when I first go in there, they're all doom and gloom. They think, oh my God, this lady's going to talk about privacy. They're going to tank our business operations. And I say to them, give me 10 minutes. Let me lay the foundations of privacy by design, and then let's explore how we can do this. And within usually 20 minutes, all of a sudden I'm getting smiles on their faces because I'm presenting it as something that is going to advance their business interests as well as their customers' interests. The whole win-win idea seems to be such a foreign concept, which is crazy. So working directly with the companies, once they understand the essentials of privacy by design, they're in the best position. They know their company's operations the best, where and how to introduce privacy by design measures proactively in order to prevent the harms from arising, bake it into the code. So we need to talk about that. And one of the first things I ask them, and usually the answer is no, is I say, do you have a data map? And they just look at me like, huh? I say, a data map maps the flow of personal information within your company. Once it's collected, presumably with consent from your data subjects, from your customers, then how does it flow throughout your organization? What different branches might it go to? Are additional consents required from any uses that deviate from the initial primary purpose of the data collection? Once they understand the value of a data map, companies do it right away. They put it in place because then it alerts them to when additional measures are needed to protect the data by design, when additional harms are being introduced that they may not have been aware of. So those are all the factors that we can deal directly with the companies and that they know best how to address. So usually you need the impetus of something like legislation, if there is, and the GDPR provides that, and then work directly with companies to enhance all the privacy interests.
thank you very much. May I follow up, Katina, with one?
Of course. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm actually also really interested in the distinction. I think that, I mean, given that you're going to have another certification, another course around trust by design, and what you see as, you know, where's the line between privacy and trust? And one of the things, so I'm part of an organization called Pivot for Humanity, and our objective is, you know, our view is that responsibility for product, services, behaviors, actions at the company level always reside at the individual level. There are people making certain decisions, making certain choices. And if that's the case, then we need to hold the people accountable, not the entity. So we talk about Google generally, but who is actually responsible for what has actually happened? And so the model we think to follow is a model of professionalization, where individual actors sort of get certified for trust by design, like you're talking about, or like doctors, engineers, teachers, all of those see a responsibility as personal and individual, and then apply that in their work. So I guess my question is from our perspective, the biggest reason for that is the sort of need to rebuild trust between industry and society. And so what are the motivations actually that are driving these coders, developers, engineers, technologists to build the products that they're building? And how can we make sure that their interests are aligned with ours? So I'm very interested to hear what your sort of perspective from on the trust certification is.
When I talk to companies, and as I said, it's usually the boards of directors, the CEOs, the senior executives, one of the first things I tell them is you have to engage your employees in what we're talking about here. So the privacy messaging I'm giving you resides on the backs of your employees. If you have a trust deficit, and there is a trust deficit largely in existence with most companies and their customers, then how do you build trust? How do you get customers to understand that you care deeply about their privacy and you're going to great lengths to ensure that their privacy is protected and that their wishes are reflected in your operations? So what you have to do, senior executives, you have to empower your employees with an understanding that the personal information you collect from customers has to be protected and shielded from any unauthorized use by external third parties or others within your company who are not authorized to access it. That's why I refer to the data map. That often helps to get some sense of who's doing what with somebody's data, and is it in accord with the expectations of the data subject. So we always have to start there. When you collect personal information from individuals, they don't give you the information to do whatever the heck you want with it. They give it to you for a particular purpose, the primary purpose of the data collection. And that's what they're consenting to, hopefully in a positive consent manner. And so you start there and you let your employees know that we can only use this data for this purpose that was reflected to, that was consented to. Beyond that, the walls have to go up, and we have to engage in very strong protective measures in the event that others in the company want to use the data in ways that have not been consented to. So it starts with a very basic talk with the senior executives, but that reflects a new appreciation or an empowerment of individual employees who actually work with the data of individuals, and ensuring that that data is strongly protected and reflected in the use case scenarios made by various individuals at the corporation. So beyond this, we'd have to talk at specific levels, which is what I do with companies, exactly how they use the data and does it deviate or not, and the requirements of a data map and how is it reflected. But I try to get across to them that you have to engage your employees, and they have to have an understanding of why this is important. The Trust by Design course that I'm going to be offering very shortly online is predicated on being given to employees, not the executives. I mean, the executives can take it as well as they want, but the employees have to understand, why is this important? Why does it matter so much? And how does it affect our business operations and our bottom line? It affects your bottom line enormously. And you will get much more valuable information forthcoming from customers if they trust you. And if they trust you and you have this trusted business relationship, you also get additional consent will be forthcoming if additional uses of the data arise later on. So we could talk about this at length, but that's the high level response.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
Those are great questions, Jumana. And it shows, Anne, if our keynotes are coming back to the preceding colloquiums, there's some connectivity happening here. There's a community forming. In our second week, we had a company called Greater Than Learning, led by Nathan Kinch and Matt.
Oh, yes, I know Nathan. Yes.
Mitka, right. And what they were talking about was just that. You need the data structure, you need a data model, you need your data definition, and then show me how you got from those privacy principles or security principles right through this process to, for example, terms and conditions on the web page. They want to show the antecedents, the tracking of, the traceability of, and that process. And that's what they're helping organizations like Autodesk to do, is operationalize this privacy by design you've created, because there are charlatans out there, Anne.
Yes.
There are people waving the flag saying, I'm a privacy by design person. I'm, going to be privacy respective. And in private conversations, what I've personally been privy to is a facial recognition company saying, oh, that's just to fool them. That's just to, we don't do that. We don't spend time doing that. Awful, really awful. But these are the things we have to be privy to. If we want to prove a chain of command or some kind of proof, I think both you and Jumana are coalescing there on the individual ethics with the actual proof in the organization and this process. It has to be obviously executed by the individual. And that's where we have a question from Teresa Anderson on trust. Teresa, can you unmute by any chance?
Oh, yes, I can. And I apologize in advance if my cat starts singing, because she's overdue her breakfast. But yes, I'm particularly interested in trust and the challenges of trust building within organizations. I love the idea of the certification that you're offering to the employees, because that is where it falls down, is you can have your message, but it's no good if the practice is different from that. But I guess I have a blue sky question for you, that if you could ask us to do one thing to help build better trust relationships, recognizing the global erosion of that trust, to build those trust relationships in the work that all of us are doing, but also in terms of building better trust relationships for society, so for the people that we're aiming to do better for, what would you ask us to do?
Transparency. I think it's absolutely critical that data subjects, individuals, know what you're doing with their information. And you have to be very, very clear upfront at the time that you're collecting the personal information from them, which is usually for a very specific purpose, the primary purpose is the data collection. You have to make it very clear to them, we will only use your information for this primary purpose intended. Beyond that, we are not permitted to use the information for any other purpose unless we come back to you to obtain your additional consent for a secondary use. And we give you full access to your data in our holdings. So the transparency aspect, you can go into this area and just, click your name or whatever, and you will see what we have on you and what we're doing with your information. That builds trust like no other. It's amazing. And then beyond that, individuals once they start having some trust, they are much more likely to want to engage with you in perhaps other aspects related to your operations or whatever. It grows dramatically. So the companies that have been certified for privacy by design, that's what they've told us, is it has grown the use of the data that is permitted. And the growth comes from the data subjects. They say, oh, we see you're using it this way, but could you also make this kind of use of it, which would benefit both you and I in some manner? And having that transparency just builds trust like no other. But it also gives companies a competitive advantage because they are then in a position to maybe obtain additional personal information if they require it in a very totally open manner. But it also allows individuals to, in reviewing their data, what the company has on them, it enhances the accuracy of that data. I think I mentioned it earlier, that the quality of the data is enhanced by giving that kind of transparency and access to data subjects in the event that there might be any errors or it might be misinterpreted or something like that. So it turns out to be a win-win. That would be my first response.
Could I ask a quick follow-up on that?
Yes, of course.
Please.
So in those situations, I study particularly ways of dealing with the unintended when things go wrong, because when things are in the wild, things never quite go according to plan. In your experience, have you seen an exemplar of where, in the midst of those mistakes, trust can be continually gained and maintained? Even in the midst of a mistake revealing itself and suddenly data leakages occurring, or...
Of course. And that's where trust builds the ability to retain your customers. If you are, let's say you have some incident that's happened and some mistakes have been made or, whatever. If you're honest about that and forthcoming, that's where the transparency comes in. And you're very straight with your customers and you say, look, we blew it. We had this mistake or, whatever the issue is. And you sort of come clean right away at the beginning with your customers. They totally get it. That's been my experience, is that they understand that mistakes happen and, problems will arise, but it's the response to the mistakes or to the negative situation by the company that is what determines the way in which trust operates. If you're totally forthcoming and transparent and you're saying, here's what we did, we screwed up, here's how we're going to fix it. So you offer the remedy and the total transparency to individuals. They're very forgiving. People are human, mistakes happen. It's the attempted cover-up, if that's the direction you go in, without that transparency, that comes back to bite you afterwards. So again, that would be my response, is you've got to be very straight with your customers. Any errors that are made, be forthcoming, offer the solution as well. Here's how we're going to alleviate that problem or fix the solution, fix the problem. But do it in a very timely manner that as soon as you realize this, you're onto it and you're into a dialogue with your customers and bringing this to their attention as well, without them having to, trip on it by accident and find out about it, learn about it from other sources.
Thank you.
Professor Uli Gretzel, I'm not sure if you're online still or you've gone for a little break. I wanted to know if you had any general comments in summating today. And I've probably caught you off guard, Uli. I'm sorry about that.
Hi,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
How to unmute. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all this conversation. So I'm doing a lot of research in the area of smart tourism. And I think privacy by design is especially important for transient populations, right? Tourists, usually they don't have a vote. They usually don't have a way to get back to a company and say there was a privacy violation once they're off of that destination, right? And so I think, if you could maybe comment a little bit on, I don't know if you've thought about this, but there's particular vulnerabilities involved when we just go to places for short term and we need something, right? We're in a strange place and we are very often happy to trade off our privacy. And then we have no real easy way to get it back. So I think in many ways you speak to that by avoiding it in the first place. But I think if you could comment a little bit on the extent to which maybe this is temporary, giving consent, right, or having the right to delete your data once you're done with your visit. There's really no need for you to have that relationship anymore with the company. So really the temporal aspect, that's what I'm interested in.
That's a very good point. People often overlook the need to securely destroy data when they no longer need it. The data has served the purpose intended at the time of data collection, and that purpose is not permanent. It's for usually a finite requirement, and once the data is served in that manner to fulfill the needs of that requirement, and that's played out, then there's absolutely no need to continue to retain the data. In fact, the harms will then arise afterwards, after the data has served the purpose intended. Then if it's used or if it's retained, it could be used for secondary uses that were never intended, or all the harms then arise at that point. And that's the problem, is you have to build in a requirement for secure destruction of the data. And the need to do this is essential. I advise many companies to do this, and often they don't want to do it. They say, well, we might have some need for the data in the future or whatever, and I can't make them delete it. But then I say to them, then encrypt the data, strong encryption, because if you don't delete the data once it's served its purpose, something's going to happen with it. There are more cybersecurity attacks, data breaches, phishing, you name it. The bad guys are very smart. And if they see databases, data sets that are unencrypted, it's an immediate magnet. They steal the data or whatever. Once you have an encrypted database, then it's not a magnet anymore for the bad guys, because if they spent enough time on it, maybe they could decrypt it and get into it, but they won't. They'll just move on to a much easier target. So best advice is delete the data once it's served its purpose. And if you refuse to do that, then at the very least, strongly encrypt the data.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Uli, as well. Thank you to three people we didn't get to ask questions to. That's Toby Shurif, a question on biometrics, which we can post to Dr. Cavoukian later. From Jason Sargent from Swinburne University, you had a great question, and we can do that by connecting you both. And also, it was Tara Hairstone. Dr. Anne Cavoukian, thank you so much for these wonderful 2 hours. You usually talk about a birthday bash on your birthday, but I think we've had a privacy bash. But we're celebrating today. We're celebrating privacy. We're celebrating data. We're celebrating new innovations. We're celebrating you and your contribution. And we're so lucky to have had you for these last 2 hours. You can see everyone saying happy birthday there in the
You're
chat.
You're so kind, Katina. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. And may everyone have a wonderful day. And to you and your family, Dr. Cavoukian, thank you.
Likewise. My pleasure. All the best to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. See you again in a fortnight.